This is the Global News Podcast from the BBC World Service. I'm Alex Ritson, and at 14 hours GMT on Friday the 7th of December, these are our main stories. The French Interior Minister says he will not tolerate any violence as the country prepares for a fourth weekend of anti-government protests. China has expressed concern at reports that Japan may be the latest government to restrict market access for Chinese telecommunications firms. The World Health Organization has demanded action to reduce road accidents, which are now the leading killer of young people around the world. Also in this podcast,
Rudolph the red-nosed reindeer had a very shiny nose, and if you ever saw it, you would even say it glowed.
So how did the rest of the herd know Rudolph's nose was red as scientists discover that reindeer are colourblind? France's Interior Minister Christophe Castaner has promised that the authorities will show no tolerance towards violent radicals planning to take part in further yellow vest protests on Saturday. He said he understood the anger of peaceful protesters but warned that extremist groups want to topple the Republic.
C'est une petite minorité.
It's a small minority that now includes people who've been radicalized, who've gone outside the law, people who've taken up violence and hatred.
Mr. Castaner said all of France's police had been mobilised for Saturday. Paris, which was racked by serious rioting last weekend, is expected to be in a state of semi-lockdown, with key tourist sites such as the Louvre Museum and Eiffel Tower shutting down. Shops along the Champs-Élysées are boarding up their windows. I spoke to our correspondent in Paris, Hugh Schofield. So the authorities seem to be expecting a lot of trouble on Saturday.
Yeah, they are. I mean, I've heard it questioned whether or not they're overstating it in order to be alarmist and in order to keep people away, and whether there's not therefore a bit of a sort of cynical motive in playing up the danger. That's arguable. It certainly suits the government to say that there's a real risk of terrible violence tomorrow, but I don't think they're lying. I mean, there is a risk. We saw it last week how bad things could be. That was the worst trouble that we've seen in Paris since probably 50 years, and it could be worse. There's no question that the movement is attracting revolutionary elements or people who want to cause serious violence and take on the police, cause the police to overact, have it descend into bloodshed. And he's right when he says the number, Castaner, the Interior Minister, when he says the numbers overall are going down, but those who are now prepared to go and protest, particularly in Paris tomorrow, are the ones who are the hardest core. So there is a real risk of violence. And I would say added to that is the whole social media aspect of all of this, in which, as we've seen, all around the world now, the social media acts as a kind of accelerator and an intensifier of emotion. The sort of social kind of inhibitions which prevented people saying outrageous things, in the old world have gone. People are saying outrageous things on social media, and that is aggravating the situation.
We heard the Interior Minister there continuing this strategy of dividing extremists from moderates within this protest movement. Is that strategy working?
Well, I mean, it's not a strategy. He's just observing what's happening. I mean, and it's true. The people who are turning up at these protests are relatively few in number. I mean, certainly last week in Paris, there were 8,000 people protesting. It's not a very serious demonstration in French terms. Around the country, there are still many people manning these protest points and roadblocks and so on. But again, their numbers have gone down. In a way, that's not really the point, though. The point is that until now, still, despite the violence of last week, when you ask public opinion, in general, public opinion is behind the broad concept of the yellow vest movement and what they stand for, which is for, get the state off our back, lower our taxes and so on. And that's the problem for the government. It's not that it's that the movement is very popular, and therefore they can't pretend it's just a tiny minority of people who are coming out to protest. Yes, the people who are coming out to protest are very, very hard line and infiltrated by, really, really hard line types. But the movement as a whole enjoys still broad popular support.
And this actually reflects not just disapproval of the French state and current policies, but it's personal to President Macron, isn't it?
Well, it's become that, and it didn't necessarily have to be that, but I think as it's gone on, this being France, the person of the president has become the sort of focus, and it hasn't helped that he's personified deliberately a kind of what they call here a sort of vertical aspect of power. He wants to re-establish the almost monarchic element of the French presidency, and that's made it very easy for people who've decided that they hate him to tar him as a Louis XVI and his wife as Marie Antoinette, and there's an awful lot of that kind of regicidal rhetoric around at the moment.
Hugh Schofield in Paris. China's foreign ministry has expressed serious concern at reports that Japan is planning to ban government purchases of equipment from the Chinese telecoms giant Huawei and another Chinese multinational, ZTE. Geng Shuang is the foreign ministry's spokesman.
The Chinese and Japanese economic and trade cooperation is mutually beneficial and a win-win in nature, and Huawei and ZTE have been legally cooperating in Japan over the years. We hope the Japanese side will provide a level playing field for Chinese enterprise and refrain from hurting the mutual trust and cooperation between the two sides.
Some countries have already restricted services from Huawei, which has links to the Chinese government on the basis of national security. Later on Friday, Huawei's chief financial officer, Meng Wanzhou, is due in court in Vancouver, where she was detained at the request of the United States. US media say her arrest is related to an investigation into possible violations of sanctions against Iran. There are now also reports of growing pressure on Huawei, especially on its commitment to meet security demands on its 5G equipment that it's trying to sell to the UK. Dan Damon heard more from the BBC's Stephen McDonnell in Beijing.
The reason they're trying to sort of make good on those types of commitments is because all around the world, countries are dropping Huawei. They were knocked back on building the 5G network in Australia, and we've heard from the Japanese government that Japanese government departments are going to be told that Huawei gear cannot be trusted, and the Chinese Foreign Ministry came out today saying this is a very worrying development. But plenty of Western countries are listening to their intelligence agencies, and if they're essentially getting this information from the United States, I should say, as well, that Huawei is too close to the government and that it will build in some sort of backdoor ways for it to assist the Chinese government to use Huawei technology to spy on its people.
What's the latest on Meng Wanzhou? She is the chief financial officer, daughter of the founder of Huawei, and been arrested in Canada. What's the latest?
Well, everybody here has a fair bit of anticipation, I've got to say, as we wait for Meng Wanzhou to appear in court in Canada in the coming hours. Finally, we might get some sort of precise indication of what she's facing in these proceedings. The trouble is, though, it could just be an initial hearing and we might not get a hell of a lot of information, but the latest theory is that she's to be accused of some sort of international financial manoeuvres where money is put through banks as a way of avoiding US sanctions on investment in Iran. But if anyone thought that this might be a quick process, they might have to think again, because legal experts are saying if she fights extradition to the US, this could go on for months or even years. Naturally, one of the things to be discussed today is whether or not she's to be given bail. I mean, one possibility is that this senior Huawei executive might be remanded in custody while she awaits trial. Imagine all this is going on while US and Chinese trade negotiators are supposed to be sitting down and bargaining in good faith to bring an end to a major trade war. Well, I can tell you that the detention of the daughter of the founder of one of China's flagship companies can be doing nothing at all in terms of easing those tensions.
Stephen McDonnell in Beijing. The Constitutional Court in Zambia has ruled that President Edgar Lungu can stand for a third term in office in elections in 2021. The details from Nomsa Maseko.
President Lungu's first period in office lasted only a year and 6 months when he took over after the death of his predecessor, Michael Sata. The Constitution says the president is only deemed to have served a term if he's in office for at least 3 years of a full 5-year term. The ruling is set to strengthen Mr. Lungu's hand at a time when Africa's second-largest copper producer is grappling with mounting debt and slow economic growth.
Nomsa Maseko. Now to something different. An ambulance rushes to the scene of a road traffic accident. Now, the World Health Organization says road deaths are the biggest killer of children and young people in the world. More than 1.3 million young people lost their lives in 2016. That's greater than the death toll from malaria, HIV or tuberculosis. Vanessa Heaney told me more.
The figure is terrible. I'd like you to imagine this. Every 24 seconds, someone somewhere in the world dies in a road accident. That's like wiping out the entire population of a country like Cyprus in just 1 year. Governments, however, have committed to cutting this number by half, but it's not happening. The numbers should be going down, but they're actually going up. Dr. Etienne Krug is from the WHO.
These are young children going to school, going out to play and getting killed because there's no sidewalk, because there's no safe playground, because basically governments haven't put in place the infrastructure to allow them to do so safely.
And it's particular countries or particular areas of the world which are suffering much more than others, isn't it?
Very much so. It's probably not surprising to learn that low-income countries, have higher road deaths, 3 times higher, actually. The problem is particularly bad in places like Africa and Southeast Asia. These are countries where people often walk along roads or they bike or they're on motorbikes, and the countries just don't have the right infrastructure. Europe's doing well. Countries like Sweden and Netherlands have actually reduced by 10 times than average just through simple road safety improvements. And this just shows that there are simple solutions, and the WHO says that we should all be doing this and taking notice of these.
Drink driving, speeding, wearing seatbelts or motorcycle helmets, and making sure this legislation is enforced. Appropriate infrastructure. So many new roads are still being built without sidewalks for kids to walk, or bicycle lanes, or even safe lanes for motorcyclists. And then making sure vehicles are safe. Airbags, seatbelts, electronic stability control, these are all relatively cheap features that make vehicles much safer.
Yeah, it's interesting listening to that clip. It reminds me of a trip I made to northern Cyprus a couple of years ago where there's a very high death rate on the roads. They'd just passed legislation which forced motorcyclists to wear crash helmets, but it didn't say where. And you could see motorcyclists all over the north of Cyprus driving along with the crash helmet on their arm, which of course doesn't have quite the safety benefits that were imagined.
You see that in a lot of places. In many countries around the world, you might have 4 people on a motorbike, for example, and of course that's totally illegal and highly dangerous. But what's interesting about road deaths is it's not just the tragedy, Alex, of losing a child or a parent. The WHO says that young families are losing their breadwinners, so families are being thrown into poverty. And we need to also think about road safety is not just about saving lives. It's also good for the environment, because if you're walking or driving a cleaner vehicle, that benefits the environment too. But it also helps us get healthy. Physical activity, as we all know, helps prevent heart attacks, strokes and cancer. And this then therefore reduces hospital costs, Alex. But one thing I want to leave you with before I go, that just whilst we've been talking, in the last 2 minutes, 6 young people have actually died on the world's roads.
Vanessa Heaney. You're listening to the Global News Podcast from the BBC World Service. Every weekend you can hear a review of the week's main news stories and why they matter. That's in The World This Week. And here's Celia Hatton to tell me what's in the latest edition.
This week, we'll be looking at the fate of the grinding trade war that's engulfed the world's 2 biggest economies, the US and China, and the second, more secret war for control of technology that suddenly swept the headlines. The United States is also sparring with Russia. After years of accusations, it's threatening to rip up a Cold War weapons treaty if Moscow doesn't fall into line. And the man who once likened his job to that of Jupiter, the Roman king of the gods, might now be looking for a new nickname.
Celia Hatton. And that's all in the world this week, broadcast on Saturdays and Sundays and available to download from our website. So far this year in the United States, there have been 36 school shooting incidents. 17 people were killed in the deadliest of them in Parkland, Florida, and another 10 in a shooting in Santa Fe in Texas. Those attacks appear to have encouraged more states to try to pass legislation that will allow teachers and school staff to be armed. Many states already allow it, including Ohio, where this year an estimated 400 more teachers have gone through the training they need to be able to carry a gun in their classrooms. Our North America correspondent Aleem Maqbool joined the latest group of teachers trying to qualify.
Something terrible is happening down there! You've got to do something! Got a gun! And stop!
It's a mock-up of a deadly school shooting, and teachers who've been training for 3 days in the Ohio countryside are putting their new firearms skills into practice to prepare, if they qualify today, for being armed when they get back to their schools.
They first volunteered, they were vetted by their schools to make sure that they are competent, trustworthy, and willing.
Joe Eaton runs this course and, of course, has no doubts about the merits of arming teachers.
Every one of these people here, if violence comes to their school tomorrow, they're all going to the sound of that violence. They're going to stand between a murderer with a rifle and these innocent kids.
Take your masks off and gather around.
A lot of the teachers being trained, though, were clearly conflicted about the whole idea. Ohio is one of 14 states where teachers are already armed at some schools. We can't name these teachers, both school principals, for security reasons.
What compelled you to come here?
We're a very isolated school building. It takes a tremendous amount of time to get any law enforcement to our building, and we just felt like that, we needed to be prepared.
What was your experience with firearms in the past?
Very, very limited. I'd say less than 5 times, ever firing a firearm.
You're in your profession because you care about young people. There are people who react in horror at the thought of teachers being armed.
Well, it's just a situation we want to make sure that if we're going to pull the trigger, that it's worth absolutely everything. It's pretty tough to think that if this is something inside your own building, it might be a kid that you know, or it might be a kid that you see every day. To make that call was pretty tough feeling.
Back together, reset.
As well as his fears of having to shoot dead one of his own students if he or she was the attacker, after one exercise, that same head teacher raised another concern to an instructor.
Like if you would be at a cafeteria and a student would raise a gun, point some at people, and you would take them down, and it ends up being a toy gun.
No. You're defending everybody else, but in that case, you've identified what would appear to be a clear threat. There's already case law established like that for police officers.
His worry about shooting dead a student with a toy gun was shut down by a trainer.
Come on down the hallway, folks. Come on down the hallway.
And some might find the next scenario the teachers were being put through alarming.
I need 2 volunteers.
As some of the teachers waited outside to take turns at the exercise, we heard the trainer preparing the others to act out the situation.
I want you in the center, pretend slap fighting.
The incident involved 2 students having a fight, and one would suddenly pull out a knife.
And then start slashing out at the people around you. Scenario start!
We went in as the armed teacher approached the school fight.
Oh man, there's some kind of fight in the hallway. 2 kids are going at it. All right, stop.
The student who pulled out the knife is shot dead.
Clean shots, clean hits, nicely done.
The teacher who pulled the trigger voices his unease.
Just because I see a knife, is that the reason to pull the trigger?
What was the situation going on?
Well, she wasn't coming at me. I did hesitate just a little bit till I seen.
That's why you're learning.
Okay, but what should I have done? Not hesitated?
If you know that knife's being used as a weapon against somebody, yeah, okay. You're protecting a third party is what that's called.
All right.
But the trainers reinforce why the student with a knife should have been shot dead.
How much distance can the average person cover in 2 seconds with that bladed implement in their hand? Especially if we're thinking about high school age kids, for example. Easily 20 feet plus. So yes, that is a lethal force implement.
Course qualification is focused solely on target practice.
Shooters, listen for the beep!
26 hits of 28 shots at a human-shaped target, and the teacher qualified, taking the next step to joining the ranks of those already armed in America's schools.
That report by Alim Makboul. Research published in the journal Science suggests that an episode of extreme global warming left ocean animals unable to breathe and triggered the biggest mass extinction in history. Terry Egan reports.
It's become known as the Great Dying, an event 252 million years ago that wiped out 96% of all marine species and 70% of land-dwelling animals. Scientists had already linked it to a series of mass volcanic eruptions in Siberia that filled the atmosphere with greenhouse gas. But until now, precisely what made the oceans so inhospitable to life remained unknown. This study suggests that as temperatures soared, the warmer water could not hold enough oxygen for most marine creatures to survive. Simulating the event on computers, scientists raised greenhouse gases to match conditions during that event, causing surface ocean temperatures to increase by around 10 degrees centigrade. Their model triggered dramatic changes in the oceans, which consequently lost around 80% of their oxygen. Curtis Deutsch is co-author of the study.
When you put a whole diversity of animals based on what we have in the modern ocean into that kind of computer simulation, you find that across the board, all kinds of animals lose a massive amount of habitat. And so associated with that huge loss of habitat is bound to be a lot of extinction.
What caused the biggest mass extinction in the history of the Earth, then, was an episode of extreme global warming, and the scientists say that lessons from the Great Dying have major implications for the fate of today's warming world.
The key question, I think, for the future is, how far are humans going to take us down that road? We hope that it's not very far and that we won't see major extinctions arising from these effects, as we know the Earth's had in the distant past. That's, of course, up to us.
If greenhouse gas emissions continue unchecked, they say, ocean warming could, by 2100, reach a fifth of the level experienced at that time, and by the year 2300 it could reach up to half that level. If we're not careful, the Great Dying may not yet be over.
Terry Egan. Now, here's a seasonal story. Scientists at the University of Exeter in southern England say Rudolph the red-nosed reindeer, popularised in A Christmas Song, may not really have been bullied by the rest of the herd after all, as the animals are unable to see the colour red. They're also unable to tell the difference between red, orange and green. Shivani Dave has more.
Rudolph the red-nosed reindeer had a very shiny nose.
Rudolph is well known for being the butt of jokes from his sleigh-pulling pals because of the colour of his nose. But now researchers say he may not have been the victim of teasing after all, because the animals are unable to pick up on the colour red. Scientists at the University of Exeter have found that they lack the cells in their eyes that humans have, which are used to distinguish between red and other colours. Instead, reindeer have ultraviolet vision and use this to see their food and spot predators hidden in the Arctic snow, because fur absorbs UV light, whereas snow reflects it. They found that Donna Blitzen and the rest of the gang also can't see orange, which means they would struggle to spot any carrots left out for them at Christmas.
Shivani Dave. And that's all from us for now, but there'll be an updated version of the Global News podcast later. If you want to comment on this podcast or the topics covered in it, you can send us an email. The address is globalpodcast@bbc.co.uk. I'm Alex Ritson. Until next time, goodbye.